So you're interested in this. Okay, maybe not this exactly, but you're interested in old school D&D. You're new to it. You haven't tried it before, and you kind of want to know what it is and how to run it. Hello all, I am Game Master Matt and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk to you about how to run old school D&D. What to keep in mind, what your mindset should be, what your player's mindset should be, and some of the tools and resources that are out there. Now, this is especially important for everybody that's kind of come from 5th edition and maybe even a little bit of 3.5, because first of all, we got to talk about what old school D&D isn't. That's very important before we talk about what it is. This, by the way, is, some people will say 2nd edition AD&D is not old school D&D. It definitely is. I started with this in 1990. Very shortly after it came out, and I absolutely love it. It is my favorite version of Dungeons and Dragons. But of course, old school goes beyond officially named Dungeons and Dragons products, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So what is it not? It is definitely not this. This is the 3.5 edition Player's Handbook. I've talked to some people and asked, hey, do you play old school D&D? And they say, yes, absolutely. I love 3rd edition or 3.5 or Pathfinder 1 or whatever it may be. That is not old school D&D. And why is it not old school D&D? Well, there's a big difference between these two right here. And it comes down to, here, let me put these away. And it comes down to how the game is played and how it is designed. In 3rd edition, you started moving beyond the gritty treasure hunting, dungeon crawling aspect of D&D and went more into the high fantasy epic nature of D&D that you're very familiar with today. You added skill lists, feat trees, hit point bloat, and just a lot of rules. Now, old school D&D does not necessarily mean rules light. You can't really say that AD&D 1st or 2nd edition is rules light. It can get a little bit crunchy at times, but it is a little lighter in certain aspects. For the most part, no skill list. Now, you can add those to 2nd edition, but for the most part, the way you should play it, or that sounded pretentious, the way I prefer to play it, is without any of those skill lists or anything like that. So you have attributes. You roll 3d6 down the line, maybe. You have fast, deadly combat. You use XP differently. All those things, and of course, Thaco. But that's not a prerequisite necessarily. All those things kind of show what old school is versus what it isn't. And that's modern D20, modern D&D, that a lot of you have probably come from, especially 5th edition. A lot of players' first introduction to the hobby has been 5th edition, which is great. I like 5th edition. I've spent a lot of money on 5th edition, but over the last couple of years, I've really come back to the roots of old school D&D and really enjoy it more for a Dungeons and Dragons class and level based experience. So now let's talk about the mindset you need to go into this with and your players need to go into it with. Well, first of all, it's not 5th edition. So you will run into what I've run into when I have run old school versions of D&D with 5th edition players. They would go, yeah, what's the equivalent of an insight check? Yeah, what can I do? Can I roll for perception somehow in this room? No, you can't. Your answer is not necessarily on your character sheet. In fact, it is much more right here. What's between your ears? How you look at the game as your character and as a player yourself. So a little bit of wall breaking there, but still, it's not on your character sheet. Into, saying insight check, well, do you believe the NPC that I, the DM, am portraying to you? Does your experience say this person could be telling the truth? Perception's another thing. You get into a room in a dungeon, and 5th edition teaches the bad habit of saying, what's my passive? I have a passive perception of X, or I roll for perception. What do I see? Well, you describe the room. That is what you see. If you want to see more, Well, then ask your players, where are you going to go? And they say, well, I'm going to go into the corner where all the old rags are and some satchels, and I'm going to rifle through there. Perfect. Don't make them roll to find anything. They looked, they found. Maybe they stumble across a trap by really looking for it. Doesn't mean they can disarm it, but they've kind of found it. Let them know they found it. Or maybe a secret door because they looked in that specific location for that. Maybe give them some hints along the way on where to find it. Maybe the dust has been moved in a certain area and that indicates maybe there's a secret door there. Reward them for saying, I'm going to go look. That is something you need to think about as the DM, and your players need to wrap their minds around. The other thing is, of course, yeah, it's pretty deadly. You should get attached to your characters, but don't get too attached too early. I mean, we can't forget this is now old school, where a wizard could have 1 hit point and cast 1 spell, or where a cleric has 3 hit points at first level and can't even cast a spell yet. They can turn undead, but they can't cast a spell yet. Those are the things you kind of got to keep in mind, and that's what your players have to keep in mind, that life is cheap. And guess what? You reach 0 hit points, you're just dead. No death saves, no -10, no ticking clock. Now you can add that, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. I would say 0 hit points means you're dead. Create a new character. Maybe you have a hireling you like, and that's the other thing. Encourage your players to look to bring others into the party that they then control. Whether it's a hireling or a mercenary, a sage, because again, you don't have this big skill list to know everything and say, I'm going to make a knowledge check. No. A nature check. No. You can ask the DM, and I would encourage you as a DM to tell your players, do I know anything about X based on Y? Give them then some information that you think they would know. Otherwise, hire a sage. Look it up in a library. Do real research. The answer is not on your character sheet. Then, of course, there is THAC0. Descending armor class, which a lot of people have made fun of in recent years, including Wizards of the Coast themselves. I don't have a problem with THAC0. That's how I grew up, but you don't need descending armor class. You can also play with ascending armor class. A lot of games, Swords and Wizardry, Old School Essentials, they have ascending armor class options that you can then play with. So don't worry too much about that. There is also a lack of, let's just say, adding new skills later on or new feats or anything like that. For the most part, in Old School D&D, you start with what you have, what you will have, and those skills, thief skills, for instance, they get better over time. You're not adding more to it. You're getting better at what your class is trained in. And that's the other thing. Skills are class based, but you can still try pretty much anything. But the thief is better at picking a lock or moving silently, or the dwarf is better at just passively noticing a trap or some oddity in the stonework. Those things do matter. The other thing is not everybody has dark vision. There are different versions of special vision. So let player know that. It's probably a little more humanocentric world. Doesn't necessarily have to be, but it's not the length and breadth of playable races that you have in modern D20. So that's what you kind of have to keep in mind. The other mindset you have to keep in mind for yourself and your players is how XP works. Don't do milestone leveling. Don't do session-based leveling. My opinion is go really count the XP, and the number one way you count XP in Old School D&D is by treasure or treasure equivalent. You know, maybe a social challenge has a treasure equivalency in there, and you give them 100 XP, split it up by 4, everybody gets 25 XP. Yeah, you get XP for defeating and killing monsters and NPCs or whatever, enemies, but it's much lower than in modern D&D. In modern D&D, you don't really get incentivized to find treasure. You get incentivized to kill things. In Old School D&D, you get incentivized to survive and get your treasure, because you get your XP when you bring your treasure back to a safe place, not the moment you find it. So you want to survive, and don't forget, you're kind of squishy in the beginning, so survival is key. Exploration is key. And of course, dungeon crawling is part of exploration, but it can be go beyond the dungeon, go into a wilderness, go into a city, go into a castle that's not a dungeon. All of that gets rewarded through this game, much like one of my favorite computer RPGs right now in Elden Ring. Exploration is what you get rewarded with. The other thing that you and your players need to keep in mind is how combat is entirely different in old school D&D. You hear the saying quite often that treat combat as war, not sport. Sport is modern D&D, war is old school D&D. I'm going to make a separate video going into the specifics of combat in old school D&D, but just a quick synopsis here. Strategic decisions matter more than tactical decisions in old school D&D. Looking at the situation, maybe retreating, and coming back to fight another day. Getting back to Elden Ring, how many of you, including myself, have gone somewhere, gotten your butt kicked, and gone, I'm not strong enough for that one. I'm going to leave. When I get strong enough, I'm going to go back. That is old school D&D. If you play Keep on the Borderlands, and you go to the Caves of Chaos, first level adventure, yeah, and you're unlucky enough to go into the cave with the owlbear, you're probably going to die. So if you take them head on, so retreat. Live to fight another day. And if you do die, go back to town, find a hireling, make a new character, and keep on adventuring. It is fun. It is fast. And those are the things you need to keep in mind. Because the other thing for both yourself and your players to know is combat's not fair. Encounters are not balanced. There is no balance in encounters, something that, say, Pathfinder 2nd Edition is very, very specific about, or modern D20 in general. Balance, balance, balance. No, you shouldn't scale your opponents necessarily with your players' levels. Have them be in the world and maybe let your players know. So I'm not advocating for throwing a red dragon at a low-level party, but maybe let them know the dragon is there. And if they choose to go there, well, okay, then it's their decision. That's the other thing about old school D&D that you need to keep in mind. It's honestly way more roleplay heavy than modern D20. Why? Because one, answers are not on the character sheet, but the decision making of your players is more important. I would lean into hex crawl explorations, random tables, sandbox style, not super linear adventures. Focus on adventure sites versus linear adventure paths. Now, you can throw in a campaign where you have some general things happening, but let your players really make the decisions. The other thing is morale checks are a major part of the game. The monster may not want to attack. You check that out. NPCs, hirelings, check for their morale to see if they're going to go with the PCs into the dungeon. And if they did and barely came out with their lives, maybe they won't go back with the PCs again. Make it truly come to life. And old school D&D gives you that framework to do that. So those are some of the things to really keep in mind for both yourself and your players. When it comes to adventure design or campaign design, be a little looser. It is quick, it is fun. Make random tables, and I'll make a video about random tables in old school D&D as well at some point. But those are the things you really need to keep in mind as far as your mindset and your player's mindset for old school D&D. Now, what resources are out there to dive a little bit deeper into specific techniques and topics for old school D&D? Well, for one, they will be coming here to the channel. So that's one thing. But if you need to know something today, go check out Questing Beast. It is, in my opinion, the best YouTube channel out there when it comes to old school D&D. Some really great, valuable information. So what game should you lean into for old school D&D? Well, you can go to eBay. You can get first edition. You can still get basic. You can get second edition, but obviously the older it gets, the more expensive they get, and you got to be a little bit careful as far as the quality of the product, i.e. how much shelf wear does it have. But you can find second edition and first edition stuff for I'd say not unreasonable price when you look at how much modern role-playing game books cost. And then, of course, there is drive-through, or not drive-through RPG, but the DM's Guild online, where you can just print on demand some things or just get the PDFs. But there are also games that are not official Dungeons and Dragons, but that lean into old school D&D. And you've probably heard this term before, the OSR, Old School Renaissance. And here are a couple. Two of the first ones right here, they're from the same person, Matt Finch. We've got Swords and Wizardry. This is OD&D, so original Dungeons and Dragons, and Osric. So this is AD&D first edition. These are some that I really recommend if you want to get that true old school D&D feel. But they do have options in here for ascending armor class as well. Probably my favorite one, so we've got Castles and Crusades is one to look at, but I'm going to do a separate video on that because it's a little different in its tone and mechanics. The other one, of course, right here, Old School Essentials. This is the classic game set, so this was basically a recreation, cleaning up, really well presented of BX D&D, and then you have the advanced game set, which takes it to AD&D first edition. But if you just want to dip your toe in and kind of see, here's one I recommend. It is White Box. You can get this right now on Amazon for under $5. It's 130 pages, kind of this little digest size. And this is based on Swords and Wizardry's White Box, which is based on the White Box, the original Dungeons and Dragons White Box. It's quick to learn, it's easy to run, and it kind of gives you a little bit of a flavor of what old school D&D is without a ton of financial investment. The other thing, of course, online you can get so many old school adventure modules and campaign settings. If we look over, whoop, that side right there, we've got Dark Sun, which is a second edition AD&D setting, which I love way more than fourth edition Dark Sun. But look at Greyhawk, look at original Forgotten Realms. I'm talking first edition. I mean, third edition was still okay. Second edition was kind of okay. Everything after that, fifth edition, forget it. But first edition Forgotten Realms is really, really cool. But again, I'm a big Greyhawk fan, so we'll always steer people there. And then you can create your own, or some of these games come with their own settings. You can get Midlands, which works perfectly with Swords and Wizardry. Dolmenwood is coming soon for Old School Essentials. So there are a lot of different settings out there. And of course, you can just create your own with the framework given in these games. And before I forget, the other thing you need to think about is domain level play. That's a big deal in old school D&D. So don't forget about that. That's something that's been completely forgotten in modern gaming and something I really enjoy. So maybe not discount that completely. Now, if you're going to go with an original old school Dungeons and Dragons, so we're talking AD&D first or AD&D second edition, I would recommend maybe getting a different character sheet than what they came with. I wasn't a big fan of those. There was nothing, there was no flavor, there was no art. It was just really just a piece of paper to put stuff on. Go check out Dice and Logos. I will put a link down in the description to where you can get an old school D&D character sheet from them that I like to use. So if you found this helpful in any way, please hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, not to miss out on any of my TTRPG content that is coming to the channel. And until next time, I am Game Master Matt, and I will talk to you soon.